Jackie, welcome to the show. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about what you do?
Well, thanks, Melissa. I'm so excited to be here with you today and to be having this conversation. So I'm a lawyer. I'm a partner at Vorys, Seymour and Pease, which is a large law firm of over 350 lawyers. And we represent clients all over the country on the full range of legal issues that they face. I am primarily an employment lawyer, but I also have a practice in privacy issues, and in internal investigations and crisis management. So I'm looking forward to talking with you today about the ways that those different areas can merge together to really help our clients avoid risk and then manage crises when they occur.
And you do such great work, and you have the mindset. So we were introduced by Whitney Gibson, who's a great friend of mine, partner at Vorys. And I remember reaching out to him. I had a specific request recently, and he was like, okay, I need to find you the right person. Our first conversation, I sent Whitney an email saying, you know me so well, you found me the most brilliant, perfect person, which is wonderful because so one of the constant struggles that I see by organizations is the struggle between the crisis management team, whatever that looks like, crisis communication team typically is the biggest kind of hurdle, and the legal department. There's this disconnect, typically far too often, with legal and understanding full realm and full scope of impact on the business, not just through that siloed legal vision and understanding, perception, which is super, super important, but super important not to be siloed today. And that's when you and I connected, was just right away grasping how familiar you are and the experience that you have and the value that you give to that alliance between your world and your realm and mine, and how those fit together.
Exactly. And from my perspective, as an employment lawyer, I have both a proactive and a reactive responsibility to our clients. And I think that's really the way our whole team tries to operate. The proactive piece is identifying potential areas of risk for a client. And then the reactive is to help them when those risks materialize. But the two pieces have to fit together. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that proactive piece, you have to understand your client's business. You have to understand where the most likely areas of risk might be for them.
Yep.
And you have to understand their company culture and values so that you can help them weigh different risks and different forms of legal compliance. Sometimes there might be two choices that are both legal to decide, well, which of those two is the right one for my organization depends on a lot of company values and culture issues. So yes. If you as legal counsel don't understand those, you're going to be limited in your ability to really do your job for your client, which is to help them mitigate risk.
And what you're describing in my world is the identify phase of my crisis ready model. It's the third phase, which is really looking at risk, stakeholders, all of that, identifying what I call your high risk scenarios. Mm-hmm. And doing that with legal as a team, as a collaboration, is so impactful because you get the best of both worlds. You get the best of both minds and both perspectives.
Exactly.
So I think I'm trying to think of who's listening and their struggles. And one of the biggest things that I'd love to kind of just set the stage with so that they can go into the rest of our conversation with that understanding and that kind of perception is, in your experience, what is a great tactic or different types of tactics, strategies of approach to get legal on board with even just the identify phase, doing that together?
So I'll give you an example of that. Probably Hipaa Compliance, mm-hmm. right? Hipaa is, as you probably know, it's a federal law here in the U.S. that governs the privacy of certain types of medical information. So not all medical information, just some medical information. Employers per se are not subject to Hipaa, but if they have records pertaining to their employee health plan, if it's a certain kind of health plan, a self-insured health plan, they might be. So when the HIPAA privacy laws came out, a lot of our clients were hearing from various consultants and lawyers, oh, shoo, we're not subject to that. We don't have to worry about it. Or just this one little department has to worry about it. But if you're going to really advise a client on that, you have to understand, well, what are those documents? How are you dealing with them? And how are they being managed within the organization? So are they being managed in a way that's consistent with HIPAA? But are they being managed in a way consistent with the promises and assurances that you gave the employees who provided you with that information?
Yes.
Are they being managed in ways that are consistent with other laws that might apply, like state privacy laws, for example? So again, I'll give you an example of that. So we had a client that had a large facility, and every employee on their first day of work would fill out a little medical history form, even though this was not a medical facility, but they had them fill out a medical history form because they wanted to be able to respond and be able to inform emergency medical personnel if there were a crisis, if there were a catastrophe or someone had a heart attack or whatever. But they asked the employees, provide us with your full medical history, and the employees dutifully did. And they wrote down every prescription they had, every medical episode they'd ever had, every embarrassing infection they'd ever had was all on these forms. Well, the forms were just stored in the drawers of the security department. And one of the guys in the security department got bored one night and started reading through everyone's history and just got all kinds of scandalous information about people he was working with. And the next thing you knew, it was all over the plant.
Wow.
So again, we went in and said, okay, it's true that particular set of records is not subject to HIPAA, but oh my goodness.
Yeah.
You've got other legal issues. You've got employee trust issues. Take your company values, take your priorities as a business, and infuse those into this decision-making about, okay, of the various options available to me, which will be consistent with my company values and culture and allow me to reduce any legal risk that I might have from this problem I helped to create. And we got through it without any lawsuits or anything from the employees who brought those concerns forward.
And so you got through it. I have so much I want to say, but you got through it without any lawsuits because of the way that you proactively managed it.
Correct.
Yeah.
So that's a fair statement.
Okay. And for listeners and viewers, that's looking at everything, not just from the legal perspective. That's looking at how do we maintain trust? I always say that crisis readiness to me has a clear definition, and that is being able to, having the entire team, so everybody being able to identify risk in real time, assess its material impact on the organization. So what does that look like? What's the scope and impact? And respond in a way that doesn't just manage it and put it to bed, but manages it in a way that fosters increased trust and credibility in the organization, in the brand. So that's a beautiful example of managing it well, not just through the legal lens. And then the other part of that is the world of risk, which is candy for me, but I understand how overwhelming it is to others. And I see that with clients. But the world of risk, unless you do a deep dive approach, which is what I call it when you look at your high risk scenarios and you really go into understanding the business of our clients and full scope and realm of what that looks like, right? The stakeholders, the business operations, day-to-day communication and flow, within the culture of the organization, cross-departmentally. Unless you take the time to do that, you're not going to even identify, who knows that those medical records are in a drawer and not on a server, protected server somewhere, right? With access codes needed to acquire it, to access it. Unless you actually, it's really complicated, and it can be very challenging to get a full snapshot picture of the risk that the organizations are vulnerable to, and then become crisis ready for them. So prevent the preventable and prepare for the unpreventable in a way that, without having to experience that misconduct and then realizing, oh, those were in a drawer. We could have foreseen this, but we didn't, because there's so much to foresee.
Right. And remember, the way those papers ended up in that drawer was starting from a good place.
Absolutely.
We want to be prepared in the event of a medical event involving one of our employees. So it actually started from a very good set of intentions that unfortunately, wasn't thought through to the end. to, okay, but what would this look like if we played it backwards, right?
Yeah.
As you say. So, what would that look like in the event that, these came out in some other way than the way they were intended?
Which goes to even just employee misconduct is a high risk scenario. That to me is something that kind of falls under that bucket of that employee who got bored and who had ill intentions, that could have come out in a myriad of different fashions. He or she happened to have access to that, and that's where that triggered from. But the category to me is, from my approach, is employee misconduct. So what does that look like? And so for organizations, you cannot fathom or predict every single way that can play out. But if you, to your point earlier with values and with looking at the different scopes of, legal risk, reputational risk, and all of the above, say, okay, but where's the threshold? Under what types of circumstances would we look at this as an issue, and how would we manage that? And then where's the threshold where that issue would then trigger as potential crisis level? And where do we fall in response to that and in management of that? What are the, who do we have that we can tap into for the legal mind, right? To look at the legal scope and risk. What are the values of the organization? So how would we guide our response in accordance with the values of the organization, et cetera, et cetera. Then I'm making that point because we can't, and I think it's overwhelming for a lot of organizations or professionals to say, seriously, you could never have predicted that risk unless you knew. And to your point, it came from a good intention. So it wasn't, we were looking at the world in rose-colored glasses. We weren't looking at the world the way that I do, which is what are all the risks involved with this.
Right.
And that's great. So it's about kind of categorizing everything and then drawing those thresholds and understanding, and then having the right resources and protocols in place to enable quick and effective response in a way that goes to not getting legally sued because you responded well, even though you couldn't predict, or you didn't predict it or mitigate it.
Exactly. I'll give you another example of a somewhat similar sort of thing. Frequently, I'll get a call from a client saying, we would like to do active shooter training. This is a
hot topic right now.
Popular hot topic, right? Again, starts from a great place. I want to help my employees be prepared if the worst happens and somebody shows up, with a firearm, whether that's an employee, whether that's an external source or whatever. But as you talk to them and you say, is that the only thing you're doing? Like, is it just, I want to be prepared in the event of a shooter? Or do I want to take steps, reasonable steps, to try to protect my workplace and my employees from violence of all kinds? And if you look into that broader spectrum, you see a couple of things. First of all, the shooter training standing in and of itself, and I'm sure it's, it's often very well done and it's very helpful, but it only goes so far, right? So other kinds of things to think about are, what are the things within my control as an employer? Not the externals. I can't control if a madman comes in my doorway, but the things that are within my area of control. What could I do to mitigate risk using those things and leveraging my relationship with my employees? So for example, at the application stage, banks do know your customer. You got to know your employee. So are we doing criminal background checks within the legal limits of those? Are we doing reference checks? Do we have a strategy for really collecting that information? In some cases, not all, it's appropriate to also do, online check, like a Google check. I used to tell companies not to do that. Now my advice has shifted on that, and it's, with the right parameters and guardrails, I think that's a good thing to do.
Can we pause there for a second?
Yeah.
Why did you, I don't want you to lose your train of thought because it's really relevant. Why did you advise not to?
Number one, not everything online is true. Shocking. So you have
there's such thing as fake news.
Well, apparently so. I've never heard that term before, but yeah, apparently so. Number two, a lot of times you can't help but stumble into information that you are legally prohibited from taking into account. Things you could not legally have asked about in the course of your application. So the person's Facebook page may not be privacy protected, so you see it and it talks about their church membership, talks about the drug addiction that they've been battling or the alcoholism that they've been battling. All kinds of things that you're now going to have to say, oh no, I didn't look at those things when I rejected that person for employment.
Got it.
So there are some checks and balances there.
And then today you're shifting. So what does that look like?
To say, if you're going to do that, have a written plan in advance. You don't just, pull up Google and do a name check and see what you find. If the organization is large enough, what you ideally want to do is have a barrier between the person who does that search and the ultimate decision maker. So the person does the search, calls out information that is legally impermissible or that can't be fact checked, and then shares that back with the decision maker. So you can put those kinds of protections around it. And if the position is going to be a high profile position, someone who's going to be the public presence of your company or something like that, or is someone that needs to have a high level of trust, someone who's going to work with children, somebody who's, going to be in difficult circumstances like that, all the more reason that you would do it. So it requires a thought process and a structure, but it can be done.
However, so with children, I mean, that's a whole other set of things. So if there's any kind of instinctive red flags, those should be at least noted, right, and taken into account. But looking at hiring a public face to the company or somebody that will just be a prominent member of leadership or within the organization, so I understand the legal risk that you want to protect yourself from, absolutely. But looking from the reputational standpoint and the way that the media loves to turn things, and looking at maybe when everything is wonderful and the organization's just in its day-to-day, nobody goes digging, but the second a crisis occurs, now everybody is digging. And then that can come back and bite and come up. Where, from your perspective, from your legal perspective, where does that line, because you can see you can see my my perspective and my red flags going up. And then there's the legal side of that. And so if we're mitigating risk from a hiring standpoint, especially when it comes with that level of prominence, then how do you kind of check and balance that one from your scope?
So 2 thoughts on that. One, if it is, if whatever is revealed on the social media information is something that would be relevant to their ability to be your spokesperson, then that is relevant for you to take into account in a job situation. It isn't just, I belong to a church, it's I belong to the Church of the Ku Klux Klan, okay? Yeah. Or something like that would be so counter to what your organization is about and their ability to credibly lead a team, that you could say, look, that isn't discriminating on the basis of religion, that is something that is directly relevant to the performance of this job. So that would be my first thought. Sometimes the things are a little bit grayer and you're making more of a judgment call. Mm-hmm. And I have actually said the words to clients, which lawsuit would you rather defend? So again, let's use our Church of the Ku Klux Klan person. We don't hire him to be a leader of a division. He sues us and says it's religious discrimination. I think we're probably going to win that claim. but either way, we're going to have to go through the litigation and the exposure and the distraction. Nobody wants that. But if that happens, would you rather have that claim? Or would you rather have the reputational damage that comes as soon as the press release comes out and they do the same Google search you did and find that information, and those reporting to that individual say, really? I'm supposed to be credibly managed by someone who says people who look like me shouldn't have full rights in the society, right? Yeah. So, I mean, quite often, if it's something that really should be taken into account, it really is job related and not simply discriminatory. Yeah. And if you can make that case, or even come close to that case, then you may decide from a reputational point of view that that's a risk worth taking. But that's why you have to know what your company values and priorities are in order.
You have to know what the risks are.
Right.
You can't just hire. You shouldn't just hire without looking at those risks or at the potential of those risks down the line. I mean, that's all about being crisis ready. And the other thing that I'm hearing from you that I really want to call out to listeners and viewers is when you are looking for legal representative, or whether that's external or internal, like I said earlier, one of the biggest obstacles that I see for crisis readiness is the misalignment between crisis management and legal crisis management. So if you're looking for the right member, everything that you're saying, the way that your mind works, and even just the question that you just posed of which lawsuit would you rather defend against, that's what you want to hear when you're looking to hire for that. I mean, when you're looking for the right legal fit in alignment with your crisis readiness in this day and age, then those are things that I get, because I'm saying this because I get asked all the time, like, what do we ask, or what should we be looking for, or what are the red flags that we should be aware of and mitigate against, so that we know that everybody's on the right page and we don't create internal obstacles that are unnecessary. This is what you want to be looking for, is somebody who comes back with answers the way that you are.
Well, thank you. And the other point I would make about that, in terms of, again, everybody wants to do the Google search, the Facebook search, whatever, in an application process, and I understand that completely, is when you're writing out that process, you're also thinking about, what am I looking for and why? Is it job related if this person, is shown, having a beer with their buddies every Friday or whatever? Why do I even care? So ask yourself why you care, and ask yourself how much you care about it. Again, using those company values, company priorities, company objectives, increasing shareholder value, whatever it is, to be the guiding force to help you navigate between, various choices that are available to you.
Excellent. Now, I had cut you off to go down that rabbit hole.
Right. No, that's fine. So we were talking about sort of active shooter and violence prevention. So we were talking about it at the very front end, sort of know your customer, know your applicant. So doing the right research to get the right person in the right job. Then once they're there, there's this sort of middle range of just the general way that you manage your employees and the kind of culture that you have. Pretty much all of the clients that I work with, I think, have some version of an open door policy, that, please come forward and tell us about problems. But quite often there is a big gap between policy and reality.
Yes.
And the corporate culture is one of, I'm not doing that. I don't want to be in the crosshairs. I don't want to be that person that came forward. Maybe I'm even afraid of the person that I am beginning to have suspicions about as potentially violent. So taking the steps to really incentivize people to come forward, and put another way, not disincentivize them to keep their head down and keep quiet, is really important for a number of forms of risk reduction, as you know very well. I often think I won't get off my own story here too far, but we worked on a data breach, a huge data breach crisis for a client a number of years ago, close to 1 million people's records that had been accessed. And when I sat down and interviewed witnesses, I found out there were at least half a dozen people who knew that there was a server that had 1 million people's personal information numbers, social security numbers, all of that stuff, on a single server produced by Sun Microsystems. Those servers come with a password, Sun123. The password on that server was Sun123. And the 2 times it was reset to Sun123. And when I asked the person who reset that server every time after doing maintenance, did you know that that was risky? Well, of course I did. Then why didn't you change it? Well, that's not really my job, and I don't want to get outside my lane.
Wow.
So that's someone else's decision as to whether to change that password. So even with risk screaming at you with a red flashing light, an otherwise very competent employee turned away. And as a result, they got breached. So breeding that kind of culture where people feel they can come forward and aren't going to be penalized for stepping outside their silo is just
empowerment. Important. Having a culture of empowerment and, rewarding employees for taking leadership decision. And I don't mean grand scheme leadership decisions. I just mean being leaders within their, if we want to call them, lanes, right? And taking that initiative to do that, having a culture where that is rewarded and empowered to do that is just, for leaders listening, that's essential.
Yeah. And obviously there are limits on it, right? We don't want employees spending their whole day telling other people how to do their jobs or something. Like everything else, it comes in a context.
Absolutely. But this is an important one.
But it's an important one. So now we have on our story of, preventing workplace violence, we've looked at the application and entry stage. We've looked at the sort of life of the employee middle stage. Now, what happens if you get to the end and you have somebody that you are terminating their employment, either because you have concerns, because threats have been made, or for unrelated reasons, but you still have a concern that this individual might be someone prone to violence. Are there things you could do at that end stage? And some of them are a little bit counterintuitive. So for example, if you're exiting somebody usually for a policy violation, you're just showing them the door.
Yeah.
But do you really want them going through that door in a state of panic and rage? And whether that rage is justified or not really doesn't matter.
It's emotional.
You're trying to reduce that. So sometimes, again, not a solution, it's not one size fits all, but sometimes it's worth thinking about, should I pay that person some severance that I would otherwise not be obligated to pay, because the default rule in the US is you're not obligated to pay that. But I could pay them some severance, and just as important, if not more important, I could pay to continue their health insurance. So maybe that continues for an extra month or 2 months. Do you really want someone who you think is unstable, who has been on your health plan where they have access to mental health care and support, to lose that and their job and their family's health care, all of that in one fell swoop, when you already think that's a person at risk? A lot of times the pushback is, why would I give extra money to a bad actor? Why would I do that? And I completely understand that perspective, but sometimes you're buying something different.
Yeah.
And by the way, you're not only buying a sense of, maybe keeping them in a slightly lowered state of panic. You can also get a release of claims as part of your severance agreement. That's a typical component of a severance agreement. You can get a confidentiality agreement. You can get a future non-disparagement. There's other things you can include in that agreement. So it's not one directional. And you are getting a number of benefits out of it. So again, not a solution that fits in every case, but a way to think about risk reduction that goes beyond just the letter of legal compliance.
Yes. And just a great exercise to undertake as a brainstorming exercise on looking at risk. And when you're making that call, and we both see it all the time, very often, is active shooter training. That's kind of the default. Even a step beyond that and beyond everything you're saying is physical security. If you're doing that and you're looking at this risk and you're classifying it as a high risk scenario for your organization for whatever reason, there's all of these different realms to look at as well. So what you're talking about, there's physical, the safety, prevent the preventable as much as possible, right? And then from my end, it's where I come in is post event. What's the business impact, whether that's on personnel, on operations, on reputation, whatever that may be. What's the crisis readiness for once everybody is safe and, the incident is over, what's the impact on business and how do you crisis ready for that? Which I find, again, it's all my candy. So I love the full realm of, before, during, after, and I love the different lens and strategic viewpoints that you take and the questions that you ask. Do you find that, so I can imagine that you probably get a little bit of pushback at the beginning, which is, to your point, why would we pay somebody, who's been a bad actor? Do you find that you're able to overcome that, and then it's a policy that's actually adopted?
Often, yes. And I think the odds of that go up with the degree to which we as counsel and our team that we bring to that process understands and articulates how this fits within the client's larger interest. So it's not just me being a bleeding heart saying, gee, be nice to this poor disturbed man. But it's really like, well, here are some things for you to consider. And here's how they fit with what I know are your business objectives, what I know are your concerns, what I know are your employee relations issues that you've had going on. Whatever it may be, the better you are as legal counsel at understanding and leveraging that knowledge of what the client's about, the more likely they are to make that decision. But sometimes, again, the client who knows, their business and knows how they're going to assess risk is ultimately the decision maker. And the client's ultimately going to say, you know what, I hear what you're saying, but guess what? If I do that, no matter what I try to do, I can guarantee you it's going to leak out to the rest of the workforce. And they're going to find out that bad guy got 6 weeks of severance. And yet when their good friend Joe who was a terrific worker had to be laid off. He got nothing.
Yeah.
That is going to cause me such employee relations problems that that's not a risk I want to take. And that's a defensible conclusion to reach, just as long as you've kind of gone through the process and consciously made the decision about how you want to weigh and evaluate different kinds of risk.
Yep. I like that. And then also the decision of, well, do we want this to be policy, right? Some form of this to be policy.
Right. And that's got a budget associated with it and all kinds of things.
And a process,
And, you know, again, you sort of have to decide, is that something I want to do? And some clients do that on a pretty routine basis. And others, it's very much the exception to the rule. And then there's, you know, all kinds of points in between. If there are contractual obligations or things that require you to do it, obviously that's a different kind of case.
Yeah. And does this all fall into, so you talk about something that I love, and it's compassionate compliance. This is kind of a segue into it, but it falls under that umbrella.
It does. So when I use the term compassionate compliance, again, it's not just, you know, be very nice to people. It's not just that.
It is an added benefit.
I mean, I don't have a problem. Nice is, you know, nice, but that's not our job. You know, we're not here to teach manners or humane conduct necessarily. We are here to help our clients reduce risk. So, you know, if you think about the word compassionate, the antonym of that word, the opposite of that word is indifference. So compassionate is really just sort of a catchy way, compassionate compliance. It's kind of a way of incorporating this idea of very conscious decision-making in your compliance efforts, and to be thinking beyond, again, just purely minimum legal compliance to the broader picture. I started thinking about things in that way and putting that umbrella term on them as we were advising clients in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey here in Houston. And I'm not sure that people outside the Gulf Coast area realize the scope of that tragedy. We had areas around town with as much as 60 inches of rain over a 4-day period. With something like 30,000 people put out of their homes, and just an unbelievable community upheaval over a couple of days. And a lot of workplaces weren't able to reopen or weren't able to reopen quickly. So they had a lot of immediate legal issues. Do I have to pay people if my workplace is inaccessible or closed? Do I have to pay my people if I'm open, but they don't have a way physically to get to me because the roads between here and there are flooded? If I have employees who are telling me, hey, I was injured in the storm, or I'm dealing with trauma from the storm, I need some time off. Do I have to accommodate that? For how long do I have to accommodate that? All those kinds of questions. So we tended to do a sort of two-part response. One would be, here's the letter of the law on when you have to pay people, who has to be paid, who doesn't. Here are some legal restrictions under the Family Medical Leave Act, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, under special protections for first responders. You know, we would take them through all of that, and then overlay on that, what is this going to mean for your ongoing management of your business and your relationship with your employees? You might choose bare minimum legal compliance, completely defensible. But you might say, I'm going to do a little extra beyond what I have to do. I'm going to let employees know that it's beyond what I have to do, but that as part of my commitment to the community and my commitment to, you know, rebuilding our business and bringing our employees back, I'm going to go a little, you know, beyond the minimum. So that's what I mean by compassionate compliance. As you're doing your compliance analysis, you add this extra layer of, okay, but, you know, in the broad range of risk, what can is there actually not to use a terrible term, but is there not a silver lining to the cloud of this terrible storm, in that maybe, you know, I can gain a little extra employee loyalty.
Goodwill. Yeah,
goodwill. Again, within budget. I mean, it's easy for me to say sitting here in my office, but if you're a struggling business that doesn't have that payroll budget to spare, then, you know, your outcome is going to be different, but you at least go through the thought process.
And And again, to your point earlier of culture and values, I have a wonderful client. One of my favorite clients and because of this, the compassionate culture that they have is they have they're a large organization. So we'll set that straight, right? That they have budget. They have facilities around the world, primarily in the US. And what they've done is they know that natural disaster is one of their, I think we have 9 high-risk scenarios for this organization. Natural disaster is one of those high-risk scenarios because, first of all, their plants are their business operation. So if those go down, business is impacted. So that's a crisis. And then also because they're so dispersed, right? They're prone to risk in multiple areas. And what's interesting too is that they've always had a budget allocated to community natural disaster management. So literally, how can they really, social license to operate is very important to them, and important for different reasons, but important also for business reasons, right? Social license to operate, they need it. So they have a set budget for every single one of their regions in the event of natural disaster or in the event of something that's their fault. So if there's an explosion at one of their plants, or if which is another one of their high risk scenarios, right? How can we make sure that we have budget aside every year that we can allocate to whether it's community welfare and recovery or something that happens because of our own doing, or maybe not doing, but something that we're at fault for. And what they recently did was they recently changed that policy to evolve that policy, I should say, to give every single region and so plant the authority to decide how that budget is allocated in the event of. If they want to donate it all to the Red Cross, they can do that. If they want to, whatever the case calls, they don't need corporate's approval. They have that authority and that approval already to allocate. They have a set allocation of budget, and they can use that however they deem the most valuable to the community and to the management of the incident. Mm-hmm. Again, large organization, so they have the budget, but conscious organization that the reason I love them so much is because this is the way their culture is. This is the way they think. This is the lens through which they see their business and their relationships with their stakeholders, which I think is just a beautiful thing.
Oh, absolutely. And that ability to, again, as you do, help clients identify the most likely areas of risk and then find that balance between control and empowerment, right?
Yeah.
A controlled strategy from the top with some level of empowerment that you think is appropriate further down. We as lawyers always get nervous when we lose control, right? And we like to see uniform systems, but sometimes we also have to recognize that this is a uniform system. It's uniform. It's just within it, we give some room for independent decision making.
Well, and a uniform system is a risk in and of itself if it's too rigid. If we look at United Airlines, I love to use as an example, not to pick on them, but to look at, so one of my crisis ready rules is people above process and bottom line always. United has a culture of process and bottom line that comes first. That's the way that the business culture is. And as a result, they have a very rigid structure, process, internal compliance, all of this that leads to a whole bunch of risk because people aren't empowered to make choices. And, leaving United out of it completely, I have a client that I do crisis simulations. We've had this conversation before. I do crisis simulations with my clients. So it's more than a tabletop. They are presented with a scenario, but there's role players, social media is a part of it, in a controlled environment. They have to get up and do. They have to test the program and hone their skills. And recently we did one, and even just talking about control and not empowering, the risk involved with that is, so for example, the communications department has a very important role within the organization's crisis management, very important role, and a very complex role depending on the organization. This is a large organization with far reach and big brand equity, so important role. And the head of communications sits at the crisis management table with leadership. Her team that's the action team that has all of their roles and responsibilities that she gives the directives that come from that table, and they act, right? They do. And when we first did the simulation, she was bombarded with nobody would do anything. Nobody felt empowered or confident enough to act within their realm of roles and responsibilities without constantly seeking her approval on the most nuanced of items. And she has a role, and she couldn't do that role because she was being bombarded with needing to basically babysit her team. So we worked, this was actually a year and a half ago. We structured the last year and a half. Their next exercise is in 2 months. And we've structured the last year and a half. We've done 6 communication department trainings. So quarterly since then, that one of the objectives was to get the entire team feeling competent in their responsibilities. And my job that I took on was empowering them to do that, in that competence, to be empowered as well. As a result, sure, there's a little bit less rigid approval, but there's a whole lot of training and more flexibility for the head of communications, where she can now do her job and she feels comfortable and confident that they are all very aware. While their restrictions are maybe a little bit less rigid than other organizations, there's still parameters around those. They're wider parameters, but she feels comfortable that they know what those parameters are. And we've set those triggers and those thresholds of this is what we do in these types of situations, and here's where you're responsible for, and here's what you actually come to her with, and here's how you triage that so you don't come to her with a myriad of different things. But just to say that there's risk in rigid structure, and there's risk in not having it as well. So it's really about training. It's about setting those parameters and those thresholds. And then I really do strongly believe in empowerment of humans, just period, but within teams, so that people can excel at their roles and responsibilities to the level that you really need them to, so that everybody can work together in congruence and exceed expectations.
Sure. And actually, 2 of those concepts are directly embedded into one of the areas of law that we work with clients on a lot, which has to do with sexual harassment and what we would sort of call the Me Too era or Me Too cases. And that's training and empowerment. And so here's what I mean. The U.S. Supreme Court has recognized that, at least in what are called hostile environment sexual harassment cases, which is the majority of them, employers can have what is known as an affirmative defense. That's a 100% defense, even if the harassment occurred, even if it was terrible. They have a 100% defense if they, took steps reasonably designed to prevent harassment from occurring. So they had a policy. It was a meaningful policy. The policy had at least 2 different ways to come forward. There was not a sense of defeatism about that, or that's not worth doing, it'll never be successful, it's a moot point. They actually had a so-called open door that actually was at least somewhat open. So you had all those pieces together, and if the individual failed to take action and tell you about it when it was happening, or if when they did come forward you had a swift and remedial response. So swift meaning reasonably timely, remedial means not necessarily tarring and feathering the wrongdoer or firing the wrongdoer. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But what it really means is taking steps reasonably calculated to keep it from happening again. So it's a long-winded way of saying do the right thing, right? Mm-hmm. Create a culture where people will come forward if there are problems or concerns, investigate them. By the way, you need to investigate them both because they may be true and because they may be false. Mm-hmm. And you owe that to everyone concerned. So you do that investigation. If you conclude harassment occurred, you take steps to keep it from happening again. And you come out the other side, and potentially you have a 100% legal defense. You've also gained an awful lot in terms of trust and employee relations issues and so on. Yep. So again, I think the 2 come together. Part of the prevention piece of that is training. Yes. I have seen an unbelievable amount of extraordinarily bad training around sexual harassment and discrimination issues. I mean, some of it is laughably bad. And it's about fear mongering instead of about, dispute resolution and resolving things and respect and all those kinds of values. And there's actually some research that indicates that bad training is not only ineffective, bad training is worse than no training, because you teach people to be afraid, be very afraid. You're teaching, men in the audience that may feel targeted in a sexual harassment training. Oh, anything can blow up against you. So how do you make sure you never get, accused of harassment by women? Just don't work with any women. And that is actually an outcome that has been measured.
Wow.
From some of the worst of the bad training. And we're actually starting to hear it a little bit from executives and others, some that are bold enough, to say it out loud.
Yep.
So again, just another way of saying to really care about the process enough to do it in an effective way that gives you that training, that creates the culture that you want, is not only good, for, crisis management and prevention, but fits specifically into a specific legal defense if the worst does happen.
Legal and reputational.
Right.
100%. They play together, and, you can win in one and lose in the other, and you lose. So whichever one that is. Yeah. Awesome. And I love that you give, I don't even have to go dig deeper from you. You give, which is what I'm all about, is like, how can people actually take this and actually apply it? So you've given those items. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank
Jackie,
you.
This has been just a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for your time. Where can people learn more about you?
So you can go to our website, which is Vorys, Vorys, Vorys.com. And look at my profile there. And it's not just me, it's our whole team. We really take a team approach to working with our clients. And you can see some of the different areas of expertise that we have and how we may be able to help you in your business.
Absolutely. And you really have, Vorys has a great culture. And I know Whitney, and now I know you, and I've worked with a couple other people on the overall Vorys team. And you're my kind of people, which is just so much fun because we get to do some great things for organizations. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time. Your links will be below this video or podcast, wherever people are listening or viewing it from. So thank you for your time.
Oh, thanks. It's been a great conversation. Happy to talk with you.